Good morning, everybody. I'm so amazed. I came a little late, Tim. I wasn't sure if you or Michael mentioned the word Donald Trump, but I've been listening for an hour and a half and not one mention of Donald Trump, which is a record because that's all I'm hearing is Brexit and Donald Trump when we talk to sourcing folks. And what are the implications of that for all of us as we come to terms with China and China bashing that's going on by Trump and all the fun that's our industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about ethical sourcing. I'm going to be quick because I think you guys want some coffee and you probably need to wake up a little bit. But I'm Ian Spaulding. I'm the CEO of Elevate. We're a professional services firm. We do a lot of social environmental auditing on behalf of lots of brands and retailers, some of which are in the room. And a lot of people say, oh, I hate this industry and this side of it, auditing. How do we actually work with factories and make sure they're good factories, mitigate risk on issues of child labor and forced labor and all that fun stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of people have some bad experiences in this side of the business. But I'm here to tell you maybe some good news, that there is this evolutionary path happening in the market. Brands and retailers are beginning to think about the last 20 years and how we have approached factories around the world in Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, et cetera, to understand their level of performance, but also to get to a better spot. How do we actually improve factories instead of policing them only? So that's kind of the thing I want to talk about. We talk about innovations in it. But I first want to go very quickly to refresh everyone who doesn't know the history of the world of ethical sourcing and compliance. It started really in the mid-90s with a TV personality in the United States called Kathy Lee Gifford. She was exposed for making product for Walmart in factories in Honduras with 14-year-old workers, and activists in the United States, including the folks in the U.S. government in the Clinton administration, basically took her to task for exploiting workers in Honduras. That largely led to that, plus efforts of campaign against Nike in Indonesia and Vietnam and China, as well as Gap and others, where we learned that actually these factories in the United States were being replaced with factories overseas, and the conditions were much, much worse. And that debate is still happening, by the way, today in Trump's America. So is there, in fact, a way to bring back jobs in better, quote-unquote, factories? So that's kind of, that happened in the mid-90s. If you carry forward, there are key milestones that have happened. What Gap has done, what Nike has done, what H&M has done in response to this. The organizations that have emerged, whether it be reporting organizations to talk about these issues publicly, or whether it be organizations like the Ethical Trading Initiative in the UK, or the Fair Labor Association in the United States, or SA 8000. And then there are other things, like, I don't know if you recall, we used to manufacture apparel for the U.S. market in this island called Saipan, which is near Guam, but we didn't use any people in the United States. We imported workers from China and the Philippines and other countries, and then we actually paid them a sub-minimum wage. U.S. minimum wage was here. It was a U.S. territory. We paid them a $3 minimum wage, and then we said on the label, "Made in USA." Well, that led to a class action lawsuit, a $1 billion lawsuit in Saipan, and lots of people were like, it hit 35 American retailers pretty hard, and that's when companies began to say, wait a minute, we got to figure out who we source from. Are we actually in good factories or not? Are they exploiting workers or not? And so then the issue of ethical sourcing became mainstream, where most brands and retailers realized that part of their operations required some type of risk mitigation and to collect data, et cetera. Now, I'll finish up with just two things. Then we had Apple in 2012, and we saw the situation with Foxconn and the suicides that happened there, and the New York Times exposés about Apple and the fact that they were making massive profits, and it was at the expense of workers in China who ultimately were in pretty tough conditions working for this very militaristic Taiwanese management style of really pushing these workers to just work harder, longer, for lower pay, et cetera. And that led to a lot of electronics companies saying, okay, this isn't just limited to apparel, but actually it's electronics as well. And then in 2013, 12 and 13, with Tazreen Fashions in Bangladesh and Rana Plaza in 2013, that's when all the trade unions and campaigners and government officials began to say, wait a minute, companies, You guys talk about auditing factories, about mitigating risk to improve performance within these factories overseas, but you failed in Bangladesh. You failed, clearly. People died because the programs you've been talking about publicly just didn't work. And so a lot of people then said, we need to have a new model. That's this accord model where companies and trade unions form a contract. And that contract means that the trade union could sue the company for what happens with a supplier, a subcontractor. That, in essence, is the accord, by the way, that 230 different companies have signed, is that kind of very new framework. But it forces a lot of companies to think about, how do we do ethical sourcing? How do we do it differently, et cetera? Now, the current model hasn't really changed that much in the last 20 years, since the Kathy Lee days. It's really about getting visibility of your factories, registering them, doing some risk mitigation, finding out which ones are ones that should be audited, doing an audit, or sending firms like mine and BV and Intertek and SGS into the factory to audit, and then finding that actually there are problems. They do work 90 hours a week sometimes. There are some wage issues from time to time. There are health and safety issues. And then there's a corrective action plan, and the factory is expected to just fix everything magically overnight, and 90 days later there's a follow-up audit. And this is the model. It hasn't deviated too much. If you look at the program for Walmart or Tesco, it generally follows the same framework. Now the question is, 20 years later, is the model working? Are we seeing massive improvement in factories? And I would say, and a lot of people say the answer is no. I see somebody shaking their head. I say that it has improved, and this is where I defend that our collective efforts have raised performance. They do. Health and safety is better today than 20 years ago, okay? Wages are up. Are they up because of what we did? Probably not. It's market forces. But work hours have come down marginally. And you generally see a lot more visibility of what's really happening. And I would say for those strong factories that are exporting, they are better today than 20 years ago. But I think we've plateaued. I don't think we're seeing further progress. We still see factories performing similar challenges. Issues of industrial relations, trade union, freedom of association, discrimination, work hours are issues we don't see massive improvement. And therefore, people are questioning, is the model working? Is it time to reset the model and come up with something new? So the kind of model that I'm describing is this kind of audit-only model. Let's police everybody. And then and a recognition that it's not leading to sustainable change, sustainable improvement. And I think in addition to that, we all have probably experienced, particularly in countries like Bangladesh or China, where there is a challenge with the issue of transparency. This is the idea that means when you go into a factory and you ask them about basic issues of work hours or wages, they magically open up their books and show you so that you could then tell them, wow, you work really long and you violate local law. So clearly they don't need to experience that conversation too often to then come back to you and say, okay, here is a new set of records. And so the issue of transparency is a real problem. And we see massive a massive degree of factories really trying to hide certain information. So how do we improve if we don't know what's really going on? It's really hard. And then, obviously, if we're talking about transparency of the Tier 1 suppliers, how do we actually get disclosure of Tier 2? And there's an expose in the making right now with tanneries in Bangladesh that are producing for Apex footwear that will then, shipping. And it's all about Tier 2, right? The issue about Wellspun, what happened in India, is all about that. Where did that cotton come from? Did people actually really disclose the true origin, if you will? So those issues are certainly there. And then a lot of people are talking about, we put so much emphasis on the factory, but we haven't put enough emphasis on the vendor, the supplier, the trading company, the agent, the middle company. And they are more, the importer in the United States or Europe, they actually play an even more important role because they're the ones selecting the factory or moving out of the factory too quickly when there are problems or because they need to save a nickel here and there. So I think there's a missed opportunity over the last 20 years of saying we need to engage the actual vendor in the middle, not just engage the factory, because they're part of this equation as well. Now, all of this has led to a kind of a need for more data on Tier 2, more data on the factory, more data on the vendor. vendor, the middle company? How do we get better, more accurate data when we're struggling with transparency, et cetera? I think that's important. As I heard Michael this morning talk a little bit about maybe their efforts to get an audit module for their software. I think that's great because they, to the extent we can collect more data, better data, that's going to help actually inform decisions. But I think ultimately, we're still questioning what is the new model of the future. And so I kind of wanted to put forward at least a couple of ideas. I think we could probably debate these. But I think there's probably two evolutionary paths of where ethical sourcing is likely to go for most brands and retailers. Path one is basically what I'm calling kind of audit plus model. So auditing is still part of the equation. It's not going away, people. I know you'd love to say, let's stop auditing. Bullshit. That's not going away. Every company I talk to who tells me, I want to stop auditing, they give us more audits the next year. Okay? So Apple, after the exposés, they increase auditing 3-4 times after the exposés. Bangladesh, all the problems in Bangladesh, more auditing is happening in Bangladesh. So auditing is here to stay. The question is, how do we do better, fewer audits, right? Better, fewer audits. And some of that is about, is there a way that we can sort of, again, get into that common standard, common framework, common system, which would be better for, I think, the industry. But nonetheless, one evolutionary path is to do auditing plus, which is really the capacity building. And I think that's what Fred, you talked about with what Weave is doing with some factories. It's about helping to solve the root cause that actually comes into as a compliance issue, as a work hours issue, as a WIP issue, et cetera. So I think that's one evolutionary path, is audit plus, from policing to really capacity building. The second one is much more about management systems. So people are saying that, look, we can't just go into a factory and look for child labor or excessive work hours. We have to go in and understand their recruitment practices, their HR department, and do they actually have the current systems, people, process to really manage things more effectively. And that evolutionary path is leading towards things where organizations like HIG, SAC, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is very management system oriented, or OHS 18001 for health and safety. These are kinds of where some companies are gravitating towards. But that doesn't mean that they're not focused on maybe some more targeted issues, like the issue of foreign workers in Malaysia or Thailand or Taiwan. Because I think when we talk about a management systems orientation or audit, we have to recognize that if you do a one-size-fits-all approach around the world, in Thailand, things are different, right? In Malaysia, it's different because you're using foreign workers and there's unique risks there for foreign workers that you need to take into consideration. So I see some companies coming and say, let's do more of a PDCA type management system audit, but then when we're in Malaysia, we do something a little bit different. And when we're in Jordan or the Middle East, we do something a little bit different. Now, all of this could lead towards kind of models that lead to internal scoring systems and then evolutionary paths where you say, if it's a green factory, then this is what happens. And you then do have a light touch model if it's a red factory, and it's critical to some of the issues that maybe Fred had talked about, where you need to do capacity building. You invest, you dig into that factory, but you can't dig into every factory. You can't fix every factory. So it's about how you prioritize and be more strategic with your resource allocation. So obviously digging into the more strategic factories by spend, by purchase, that also have critical issues, and investing in them differently than just the audit model is kind of one strategy I think a number of companies would deploy if they're going down this audit plus approach, okay? If it's really the management systems kind of approach, I think over time you'll see companies changing. And so things like your scorecard, right? If I'm a company and I have a scorecard that says if you have child labor, you fail, then you can't just go automatically to, okay, we're going to audit your HR department and then magically change the scoring system. Typically, you would make changes over time, and you would then say, look, we still don't want you to hire child labor, but we're going to give you credit if you have a really robust HR department where somebody submits a fake ID And it's not a willful neglect of your HR system. It was someone circumventing it. And so we're not going to treat it as a zero tolerance issue. We're actually going to understand how it slipped through the HR department. And so that's kind of an evolutionary path. We're saying, look, let's put a little bit more weight on the scoring, on your effort, your energy, your system, your capacity to manage it, and less weight on whether you missed the target, right? So you worked 80 hours a week. Who cares? The issue is, how are you addressing it and managing it so that you don't repeat it next time? And that's the score, is based on that management system approach. So anyway, those are some ideas for you to think about. Obviously, with this evolutionary path within our industry, it means that we probably need to think about metrics a little differently, because today's way of measuring programs, it's about how many factories, were they audited, what's the score, how many violations, did we do the CAP closure, the corrective action plan closure? Tomorrow, it's probably much more about, okay, let's segment the supply chain. Let's look at our strategic factories, and let's engage them more intently. And the transactional factories, let's try and reduce them. Etc. So number of factories engaged. Do we have transparency? Do we have data that's, instead of on an annual basis, it's much more monthly? Are we actually seeing that, are we looking at the leading indicators, like such as turnover, or instead of working hours, we're looking at more HR related issues, or production lead times that could be an indication of actually the work hours issues that we see in the audit. So that's kind of a slightly different orientation, but recognizing that the metrics we use for the last 20 years may not be the right metrics we use for the next 20 years, okay? And that means data. We need to get data through better audit programs, better correlating data from quality and production, as well as sustainability or compliance, and pulling those data together as much as possible. So I'm trying to catch up on time, so I'll finish out with this slide. I know it's quick, but look, the model has plateaued. Auditing as the only tool in the toolbox has been debunked, okay? If you are doing auditing only, you are not running an effective program, period, okay? You have to think differently. 20 years of history shows that that's only going to take you so far. And I know a lot of people say, well, mass retailing is different. Discounters are different. Retailers are different than a specialty brand. Bullshit, okay? You can actually segment a supply chain, focus on the top 20 factories, top 50 factories, top 100 factories who represent a significant spend, and engage them differently. And that can actually result in better performance of those factories, stronger relation, and ultimately better risk mitigation. For transactional, for seasonal, for other, maybe you still need to deploy the audit-only model, but I don't think we need a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, obviously, we need to think about impact and effectiveness differently, and how we integrate it better with the business. I think a lot of people in the room are sourcing people, and look, how many times do you really engage proactively with people in your compliance or CSR department? Not often. You engage when there's a problem. Okay? Factory fails. So then you get called up. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to get another factory? Are you going to kill this factory? Etc. I think there needs to be a little more strategic thought about how we integrate the sourcing with sustainability and have shared objectives to improve performance. Now, the new model that I'm articulating, I'm not saying it's one model. I'm saying there's a couple of ways this could go. But a new model would put and should put more emphasis on performance, on data, on more bottom-up solutions. And I think instead of just tick-the-box compliance. I think we, at a minimum, even if we say, look, I don't know where this would go, I think we need to put a little bit more emphasis on the plus side, capacity building. How do we help the factory instead of just policing them? Now, you can't, as I said before, you can't boil the ocean. You can't fix every factory, especially for some of the companies with larger supply chains. So I think it's really important to do that formal segmentation exercise, and really sort of analyze put all the data in one magic Excel pivot table, okay? Which is let's put all vendor, factory, by product category, by spend. Put in the quality data, put in if you have a pricing data or rating system or a logistics data set, and then put in the compliance data and just see what the data tells you. And I'm pretty sure you will see some aha moments, which is, oh my God, top 10 factories continue to perform poorly on these areas, and no one has ever had the strategic conversation, which is, look, you're one of our top 20, top 50 vendors. Let's get you to a better spot. Let me stop there. I think we have time, 1 or 2 minutes for questions, and then we'll talk about Trump later. So.
Okay.
Tim,
well,
yeah.
Ian, thanks for being quick about this. So you did make up some time. Any questions out there?
Yeah.
How do you control the fact that, okay, so very well-known fact, how do you control the fact of the honesty of the people that go in on your company, the
Sure.
social compliance, because we all know what
Yeah.
happens. You want to get a Walmart order.
What are you suggesting?
I'm talking-
I am trying to understand you. I know what you're suggesting. I'm
No,
joking,
I'm
actually.
trying to say, okay, is that you have a mentality
Yes.
in China,
Yes.
all right, which
It's not just China. Don't go there. It's
understand.
global, but
There's no
obviously we
doubt
do have
that-
challenges that are unique in China. So
But you still have some of the ethical financial transactions
Yes.
that go not only with compliance,
Yeah.
but also with
QA inspection. Yes.
You know.
Look, I think this is, again, I would say that one of the root causes, there's many root causes of this issue of bribery and corruption in the QC inspection world, in the compliance world as well. One root cause, of course, is that, there's a history and there's a lot of where this has been accepted behavior in the past. So let's not go there. But generally speaking, I'd say one of the things that this room needs to think about is, to the extent that your respective program drives bribery, or not. I think a lot of people say, well, the burden is on the audit firm or the auditor to always mitigate the risk. But I will tell you, we track bribery attempt rates for every factory, and we have about a 3 to 4% bribery attempt rate. So that means every 100 audits we do, it's 3 to 4% of those factories will offer us money. Should it be 10%? That's a debatable thing, right? Should it be 20%, right? But I would say that when we analyze it by customer, some customers it's 10% and some customers it's 1%. What are the differences? Well, the customers that are at 10% are comply or die. You either comply and you can do business with us, or you don't, and we terminate your business. So let's not be surprised that people look at somebody who's on 8,000, 12, 15,000 RMB a month and say, you're going to make a $10 million decision for me, so I might as well see if I can get through the system. And that happens. So I think there's a little bit, it's a complicated issue, and it can't be sort of summed up in a kind of this event. But I would say, anybody who wants to talk about this issue of bribery and corruption, how it's being addressed, the good news and the bad, I'm happy to talk at lunch or after. Or maybe the one thing I'll say is there is a new emerging organization called the Association for Professional Social Compliance Auditors. It's set up by Elevate, my company, BV, Intertech, SGS, et cetera. And it is a registration, accreditation, and oversight body of auditors. When auditors are caught taking money or asking for money, they're banned. Okay. Now there will be an investigation and due diligence or due process, but ultimately we've never had that. That's why you could wake up one day and see this guy used to work at SGS and he's now at BV, but we all know what happened when he was at SGS. He took money, he was let go, and then BV didn't know because they didn't do a reference check or something like that. So I think there are efforts to mitigate this and try and reduce it. Yeah.
One more question. Do you audit the subcontractors of the factory?
Up to the brand retailer who hires us. So the answer is yes, we do, but it depends on obviously the company and do they ask us to do that. Yeah. There was one other question. I don't know. Before we go. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I was just recalling one of the earlier slides which had all of those kind of major milestones.
Yes.
And I actually worked in Jakarta at the time.
Of Nike and Reebok?
Factory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was with Mattel at the time.
Okay.
7,000 workers. And overnight, we all had to become experts on
social compliance.
The subject. And it spiked and it cooled off. And I was working for a different company when the Bangladesh collapses happened.
Yeah.
And I remember our company CEO called me one time in my career to say, "Hi, Kevin, it's so-and-so.
Yeah.
Please, God, tell me we have nothing in Bangladesh." I was like, actually, no, but the spike came back again.
Yeah.
And it kind of ebbs and flows, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, some of it for me is exactly some of the points you said about the practicality. A real skeptic would say, the factory knows you're coming on Tuesday.
Yeah.
I borrow fire extinguishers from the neighbour, and then I send them back the next day, and the guy
Sure.
puts a mask on and has a funny mark on his face
Yeah.
at night because he never wears it. Making this a really, truly sustainable
Yeah.
part of business life.
Yeah.
Do you think we're getting there? Is it perceptions? Is it the moral high ground? How do we actually make it not just because something collapses and then 5 years later something else happens?
I have to say, I am as jaded as anybody in this industry. Okay, I have been through bribery and all kinds of issues, right? About child labor, going into a factory with 200 child workers, right? I've seen a lot of crappy stuff in the supply chain around the world because I've been doing it for 20 years since Kathy Lee. But I am actually optimistic. I see change happening. I do. I see wages go up dramatically. I see health and safety get better. I see child labor come down. And I see that factories are realizing that some of the games they played before not going to be things they could get away with. Social insurance payments going up. Look at just China. China's changed dramatically over the last 20 years. And Bangladesh has changed in the last 3 years as a result of the Accord and the Alliance and the government and the ILO. So I am optimistic, but that doesn't mean we don't have an underbelly in Tier 2. That doesn't mean we don't have challenges with factories that are struggling to survive because they're in a financial situation, and they will then take shortcuts, subcontracting unauthorized, using labor agents who use workers who are underpaid, et cetera. And I think there's a lot of people from Australian companies, and we see that just 3 days ago. Produce fields in Australia use Malaysian workers, used from labor brokers, and they're not even paid the minimum wage, right, in Australia. So this stuff is not just limited to developing countries where we source garments. It's actually stuff that happens in a number of countries. But I'm still glass half full. And I think those of you who want to get on the journey with Elevate, we're trying to elevate the industry. It's my commercial, right, real quick, as she tells me to stop talking. So we want to elevate the industry. So to the extent that you guys want to think differently about how to do this stuff better, come and talk to me. Let's figure it out together. I think we have some good ideas, and we'd love to work and talk with you and see if we can, help drive, the next 20 years better than the last 20 years. Okay. So thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, so it's time for coffee, tea. We're going to come back at 11:30, so it's a pretty quick break. Just a couple of points. One, get out your business cards. Say hi to somebody, okay? Number two, there's a booth back there if you want to see our CBX software. There's some kind of innovative ideas over there, so just you can swing by, look at it for about a minute, and that's it. We'll see you in a second. Okay.